And I guess let's get into it. So my opponent started with d4. And I had just been kind of experimenting with openings throughout the entire tournament. I decided I kind of wanted to attack this game going into it. It's often not a great strategy to like come into a game with a plan. You want to feel out your opponent and see if like being aggressive or being passive or maybe based on the position is the right thing to do. But I hadn't really had an attacking game yet, so I decided I wanted to kind of play some sort of gambit opening and see if it worked. So I started with knight f6, my opponent played c4, and I played d5. And my opponent quickly took this. And now there's really only one sensible move, I think, for black here, which is what I played in the game. Again, no opening theory backing any of this up, but when I was staring at the board, I realized that knight takes d5 was not good. Doing something like g6 would be pretty bad. That would just let him play like knight c3 and e4, solidify his center, maintain the extra pawn. So, like, why is knight takes d5 bad? He can just play e4. For example, my knight retreats. He has these two pawns in the center. So even though I'm not down a pawn, he just has massive open lines for all of his pieces. Great control over all the center squares. Whoops. Like this. And he's kind of just like chasing my knight around. You know, I can go to b6 or to g6 or f6. And we can kind of see from the evaluation, I mean, you don't have this with you at the board, but I trust the computer that white has a significant advantage in this position. So I didn't think I could take with the knight. Taking with the queen is kind of bad for similar reasons. He just starts chasing my pieces around and develops his pieces. So I ended up playing c6. And he gobbled up that pawn as well. I took back with the knight. And he ended up playing e3. There were a couple of ways that I thought he could maintain the extra pawn at this point. It looked like e3 was one of them, just solidifying his center, protecting the pawn that is being attacked twice with another piece. Knight f3 looked okay, but I was thinking about maybe something like bishop g4 to like remove the defender from the pawn, continue going after you know, something like this, which maybe the computer doesn't love, but this was kind of the idea. You know, if he continues developing like knight c3, we can just take, and take the pawn. And at least I've won my pawn back. White is a little ahead in development, has some open lines for his bishops. You know, my king is a little exposed, and I'm still a few moves away from castling. But this was kind of what I was looking at in the game. But he ended up playing e3. And when I was taking a look at this game earlier, while I was setting up stream, I got to this position, and e5 actually, top recommendation of the computer here, the engine, was something I seriously considered. But I was a little worried about playing this move for one reason in particular, which is that could I castle long right away? Yes, I could put my king on the c file, but like both of these files would be open, and even though the queens are off the board, my king would be under a lot of pressure. Like he could put a bishop on f4, and it would be annoying. I think it's possible to play like that, but I would probably be in trouble. But so this e5 move, I was mostly worried that if pawn takes e5, queen takes queen, king takes queen, knight takes pawn, wasn't good for me, I would have kind of squandered all of my ability to like make some sort of counterplay in exchange for the pawn that I'm down. Because once again, you know, my opponent just has this 6-on-5 pawn advantage out of the opening. We've traded queens. He's lost the ability to castle, so that's something. But, you know, like bishop b5 can be played. He's going to get his pieces out. And if I don't really have an attack, I was a little worried that this might be some sort of opening theory that's just good for white. So I looked at e5. I thought that it was maybe playable. Computer says it's the best that I can do. But I was mostly concerned that I was just going to run out of material too quickly. Also important to note, in this last round, our fourth board had to forfeit his game. He had so we played, I played with a friend from school, and then my old chess coach found us two teammates who were students of his, so high school kids, but one of them had to actually get back to school for a tryout for one of his varsity sports teams, which means he had to leave for the last round. So we were already on, out of 4 points, we had lost a game. And so me playing for a win was kind of important, at least I thought so. So I ended up playing bishop f5. Pretty natural looking move, I mean, just developing a piece, you know. And my opponent played bishop d3, which maybe there were a bit better ways to play. I thought that if he just played something like knight f3, then he would be in good shape. I could play e6, but this bishop right here is going to become a target for his knight eventually. Not immediately, but you know, at some point in the future. And so my opponent could just keep developing, like knight c3, bishop e2, for example, castle, and then eventually go after this bishop, which is a little bit misplaced, being outside the pawn chain and being able to be easily attacked by white's knights. But my opponent didn't do that. He was, I guess, just kind of following general principles. When he's up material, he wants to trade pieces. So bishop takes, queen takes, and now I thought this e5 move was a little stronger. White can't take because the queen's pinned, or the pawn's pinned to the queen. So, and white can't push because I have that square protected. So there's a couple of ways to deal with this, you know, tension that's going on in the center. I mean, he could play knight f3 or knight e2 to defend the pawn, or there's this interesting move queen b5, and I kind of had to look at all of these things, because if queen b5, he's threatening to take this. Now the pawn's unpinned, he can capture this with his pawn. Once he gets his pieces developed, he can put a rook on d1, kind of opposing my queen. So he had a lot of options. Knight f3 does not work. This is kind of the easiest one to see. I can just fork the queen and knight, and he doesn't really have any counterplay to this. But queen b5, what I was going to do in the game was take the pawn, and he has a lot of options here. I mean, he could take b7, he could take this, and depending on what he did in this position, I saw a couple of ways out for myself where I could basically like trade off into equality if I didn't have anything else. So once I got here, depending on what he did, I was going to spend my time calculating. But he didn't end up going for this. And in fact, the computer actually likes black's position after pawn takes, you know, pawn takes, queen takes, for example. It looks like, you know, maybe I bring a rook to d8 and go after white's king. My pieces are a lot more active. Bishop b4 check is coming. So it looks like I'm doing okay here, despite the fact that white can just capture a pawn on b7, and you know, it looks like it puts a lot of pressure on this piece and this piece. But he didn't end up doing this. He went with the more solid knight e2. I ended up pushing e4, which might have been a mistake. My thinking was I kind of wanted to clarify what his queen was doing. Is it going to b5? Is it going to b3? Is it going to c2? Is it going to d1? I wanted him to make a choice before deciding where I wanted to put my bishop, like e7, d6, b4, for example. But I think maybe leaving the tension here, because once again, white is not really threatening to take this. I can even play bishop d6, and if white takes this, it's not this move that is scary for him, it's the discovered check. Bishop b4 check, and I'm hitting his queen. So I could have just played bishop d6. I think that would have been a fine move. Obviously, he doesn't need to blunder. D takes e5. He could do something like develop his pieces or castle or something like that. But I ended up playing e4. And he went all the way back to d1 with his queen. Now I developed my bishop. And I was honestly hoping that he would just castle here. If he castled, well, the computer liked the bishop takes h2 idea for a second. It looks like it's still the best move. But this is kind of a popular theme where you can play knight g4 check, and if white goes back, they're in a huge amount of trouble because queen h4 is just going to be mate in a few moves. So the white king has to step up, and things get a little messy from here. You know, queen g5 comes, I'm threatening a discovered check, winning white's queen. So I was really hoping that he might fall into something like this, or more so, bishop d6 just makes a threat so that if he castles, he might be in trouble. So I guess I should say, hoping for your opponent to make a mistake is not really a good way to go about playing chess, or any other sort of game for that matter. But bishop d6 did have a threat if he did castle. My opponent did not fall for it, unsurprisingly. And so he ended up playing a3. This felt a little slow to me. The move's fine, it doesn't do anything bad. It kind of prevents an idea of like knight b4 and knight d3, solidifying my knight on this nice little d3 hole that he's created in his position. It obviously prevents bishop b4 check, but it seemed as if he didn't need to do all of this. He could just develop his knight, eventually castle, you know, before or after playing knight g3, for example, and just get all of his pieces out. So I was a little, it kind of felt weird just seeing this a3 move. I continued with my development. I castled, and he played. He developed his knight. At this point, I have a score sheet that I'm reading off of. So if I'm ever like looking down, that's probably where it comes from. And at this point, I ended up playing queen d7. There were a lot of options. I looked at knight a5. Kind of the idea of knight a5 is that, you know, this square, this square, this square, these are all light squares, they're weak. So I want to reroute my knight to like one of these locations, put some pressure on these squares, and, you know, maybe invade, maybe be able to trade my knight for this bishop, or just reposition my knight to a better square. I mean, obviously this bishop on c1 isn't great right now, but my bishop is sitting very pretty, and removing a defender of the dark squares could be important for later in the game. So, okay, so I considered knight a5, which looks like the computer engine's top choice. But I just ended up, I think, developing my rook. Yeah, I played rook f to e8. Maybe this move wasn't, oh, I'm sorry. I played queen d7 first. This is what happened. Yes. My theory was just, you know, I mean, for one thing, I'm threatening queen g4, which, if nothing else, is going to mostly force white to castle, because let's say white passes the turn somehow, rook b1, right? Queen g4, if white goes knight g3, I think having my queen just sit on okay, well, maybe not in this position, because there's a knight f5 threat looming, but I was thinking that if my queen could just sit, okay, this also doesn't work because he's threatening to take this. Well, anyway, I had some ideas of bringing my queen over to the king's side to create some pressure or some sort of an attack, and if white castled into it, I felt like that was going to be good for me. But maybe the tactics don't exactly work out in this exact scenario. But my opponent did play knight g3, and at this point, I ended up defending my pawn. I I did briefly consider taking this, but again, it kind of seemed as if like I've given up one of the best assets in my position, this bishop that is completely unopposed on the dark squares by another bishop, which is sitting behind his pawns. I've opened up the h-file for him in case he wants to create an attack. His king isn't necessarily weak in the center. I have no way to break through this pawn structure right now and open up the position. And I'm just helping him by trading pieces when I'm down a pawn. You know, he has this really, really nice protected pass pawn on d4 for an endgame, so if all the pieces come off, he's just going to very easily win the game. So I need to avoid doing that. So I thought about it, but it seemed like just maintaining as many pieces on the board as possible was probably my best hope at creating some sort of counterplay, maybe even playing for a win. So my opponent ended up playing b4. And I didn't think that this was a very good move. It looked like, you know, he was starting to create some threats. I mean, obviously b5 might force my knight into an uncomfortable position. I could always go to a5, but, you know, from there, if he manages to control those two squares, maybe my knight's trapped out on the edge of the board. But these pieces haven't moved. His king is still sitting in the center. And so I thought this move was fairly weakening. Now the computer, it looks like, is giving bishop takes g3 is now close to equal for black. And maybe that's a good idea. You know, white has wasted a lot of time with this a3, b4 idea. Now all of my pieces are developed. My rook on e8 is actually kind of in the game. Once I play takes, takes, I can go rook c8. This creates an immediate threat on the knight. You know, if white were to castle, then I could just take one of these pawns, for example, and then play rook takes c3. So maybe this is a position worth considering going into, but again, I was kind of in the mindset that I wanted to keep as many pieces on the board as possible. So I just played rook c8 immediately. Nothing wrong with that move. My opponent played bishop b2, and I started getting ideas in my head at this position. If my opponent had played bishop d2, I think I had looked at the idea that the computer is giving. So bishop takes, pawn takes, knight takes d4, I think. Takes and queen takes. This white king is sitting in the... Apparently not queen takes. Oh, e3, e3 immediately. Right. And this white king is just sitting in the center of the board. If bishop takes, that hangs the knight. So that's not great for him. Now I've gotten back my material, the piece that I had sacrificed by knight takes e4, and I'm putting a lot of pressure on his king. So it's still down a pawn, but this probably looks like a good position where I have some winning chances. If pawn takes, well, the e3 pawn's pinned. Apparently I can't play queen takes d4 now. I'm not exactly sure why, but the computer says that this move isn't great, but rook takes c3 apparently. And then something like this has some potential to be a playable position for black. I mean, black's down a full rook in this position, but white's king is kind of isolated. So these ideas were cropping up all over the place once, you know, once I played rook c1. And it does kind of look like white's putting themselves in a bit of trouble. You know, this a3, b4 move destabilizes the c3 square, so that square is easier to attack. The white king still sitting in the center, hasn't castled. Again, feels like maybe white should have done a bit more with their tempi in the early game. But my opponent didn't play bishop d2 and instead went bishop b2. And here's where, once again, I started having ideas. So this whole concept of pawn takes, knight takes, d4 no longer works, because in the previous position that we were looking at, bishop was on d2, the only way to capture the knight is with the pawn, which allows this e3 break to come through. But after queen takes d4, black is just down a piece. So this idea doesn't really work. Again, I could have gone for this and just played a passive game, kind of argued that this bishop on the dark squares, trapped behind all of these dark squared pawns, is not really worth its full point value or material value. There's just so much banging going on upstairs. But I just didn't like this position for black. Maybe this is one of those spots where I could have said, okay, I would be happy with fighting a tough game for a draw. But it doesn't look like I have a lot of winning chances in this position. At least from my perspective, I didn't think so. Maybe my evaluation's wrong about that. But I didn't do that. Instead, I saw a fun idea and I went for it. So the fun idea I had was knight takes b4. Piece sacrifice. White basically has to take. I mean, if white just castles, then I stick my knight on d3 and I have an excellent position. So white has to take the knight. I play bishop takes b4, and now I'm hitting his knight on c3 twice. So again, white has to respond. If white just castles, then I can play bishop takes, rook takes. You know, this pawn on a7 will fall, and I'm still not exactly out of the woods in terms of you know, like I have this isolated pawn, it's not very close to moving up the board and queening, but I do have a passed pawn, it's an outside passed pawn. If I can maneuver my pieces in a meaningful way, maybe I can get this b pawn moving up the board and make winning threats in the position. Meanwhile, this pawn on d5 or d4 looks like it's going to be pretty easy to stop. I can sit a knight on d5 for the rest of the game, and at least my pieces will be on good squares. But this position felt playable to me. So once again, if white wants to maintain an advantage, he's going to have to do something about this, this knight on c3. So my opponent played rook c1. I added some more pressure to the pin piece. It's very important that I continue putting pressure on this piece, because if I give him one moment, like let's say I play a move like g6, then white can just castle. I don't have any threats in this position, and all that's happened is I've lost a full piece. So I must continue maintaining pressure. So I played knight to d5. He played knight back to e2, again adding some more support to his knight. And in this position, there was really only one way to continue adding pressure. I had calculated all of this up to this point, and this rook is not really going to be able to aid the defense of this knight at any point. It's just too far away. There's too many pieces to move out of the way. So white has the ability to defend this knight with 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces, and maybe his king, but we can get to that in a second. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces that can attack it. So theoretically, I should be able to win back this knight as long as I can apply enough pressure. The problem is I don't have time to let off the gas by playing a move, for example, let's say rook c6, right? My whole objective is here to double my rooks, maybe put my queen on c7, and then go after this knight with all 5 of my pieces. Again, I'm only attacking with 1, 2, 3 pieces. He's defending it with 1, 2, 3 pieces. He has time to get his king out, castle, and then his position's just great. He's up a full piece. So rook c6 doesn't work. I could move my queen. You know, I could play a move like queen c6, which does add another attacker. Unfortunately, my pieces are kind of lined up in the wrong way. Like if he castles and I take and take and take and take, I can get 2 pieces for 1, but the 2 pieces I'm winning are rook and bishop for my queen. So this is no good. So we can't do that. So the only real way to continue increasing the pressure is to play things that are forcing. So rook takes c3. is what I played. Now my opponent has to recapture, and my rook can come to c1 with tempo, once again, adding some more pressure. Now there are a lot of possibilities in this position, and I think my opponent might have kind of gotten lost in the tactics a little bit. I mean, I thought the position was unclear, even though once he recaptures this, I'm going to be down a full rook if you just count the pieces on the board. 2 rooks, knight and bishop, rook, knight and bishop. So, you know, if he plays something like knight takes c3, I'm just down a full rook, temporarily. But so my opponent took back with the bishop, I think. And once again, I must play knight takes c3. There's just nothing else I can do. If I take with the bishop, I no longer have the pin on this diagonal, and I can't continue adding more pressure. If I play a move like rook c8, he can just take my bishop, and all the pieces get traded. So knight takes c3, only way to maintain the pin. My opponent played knight takes c3, which I thought actually after the game that rook takes c3 was a little stronger. Kind of the point being that almost no matter what I do at this point, he's going to be able to castle on the next move and maintain a pretty friendly position where he's going to be up a little material, he's going to have good pressure on this pawn in the long term at the very least. But anyway, he played knight takes c3, and I played rook c8. He castled. I played rook takes c3. So I looked at a couple of options here, and you can already see that the computer evaluation is just awful for black in this position. But there are a couple of assets that black has, and I think this is kind of important to understand if you're trying to create chances for yourself to get a decent result in a game of chess. You want to have some sort of advantage somewhere in the position. So let's see, hold on. Can I step all the way back to earlier in the game somewhere? Okay, I will remember that move 20 down here is where we're at. So like in this position right here, does black have any kind of advantage whatsoever? Well, black has a little more space on the king side, just due to this e4 pawn. But overall, you know, we got A and B pawns here, A and B pawns. We have 2 knights, a bishop, 2 knights, and a bishop. Black is a little bit ahead in development, but white is eventually going to get castled and develop all of his pieces, you know, like this. So there isn't really anything black can say that this is the thing I have that is stronger than what my opponent has. Now if we jump forward to move 20, okay, we're going to recapture this piece. So eventually we're going to have a bishop for a rook. We have an extra pawn. You know, we have 6 pawns, our opponent has 5. So we're down in exchange for a pawn. But we actually have some assets, like this B pawn and this A pawn are completely unopposed. Connected passed pawns can be a big asset if you can get them moving down the board. And so over the past 10 moves, 10-ish moves, I've been able to transform the position from one that, okay, might have been slightly worse for me, but where I had nothing that I was really fighting for or claiming it as an advantage over my opponent, to the fact that now I actually have 2 connected passed pawns that could provide me with some sort of threat to even win the game, despite being, you know, -4 or down 4 pawns worth of material according to the Stockfish engine. Okay, so we're in this position. We have to decide how we're capturing the knight back. I looked at both possibilities, and I thought that both of them kind of unfortunately led to issues for us. Bishop takes c3 looked like we were going to have problems after the move queen b3. And the reason was basically like, I have to move my bishop somewhere, okay? The most natural candidate is not to like walk into the opponent's position, even though that might be the best move. It looks like just retreating to our own safety is good. But even if all white does is take the rook and then put their queen on some square like b5, these pawns are going to have a really hard time advancing from this position. White has a passed pawn that's actually has real potential to move down the board. And this rook hasn't even gotten involved yet, and it can easily come to e1 or b1 or even a1 and put some pressure on the black position. All black is going to need to do is be careful to avoid a checkmate, play g3 at some point, and white seems to have a pretty good position. So I didn't really like this that position, which is why I played rook takes. So my opponent recaptured, takes, and queen b3. And it's a very similar spot, but the difference here is that my queen's sitting on d7 instead of c8. And from d7, my queen's actually controlling this b5 square, it's controlling the a4 square. So white's queen is a little bit more restricted. So I thought this was slightly better for me. I did retreat my bishop to a5. And now my opponent probably played, I guess, his biggest blunder of the game. It looked as if, some move like rook c1 or rook a1 or even rook b1, one of these moves, just getting this rook involved in the game, since it hasn't really done anything yet, was the best thing to do. My opponent had the same idea, but he went about it maybe in the wrong way. He ended up playing f3. And, okay, so he's looking to open up the f-file, maybe put some pressure on the f7 pawn. I basically have to take this. If my opponent gets to play, like for example, if I just play g6 and my opponent takes, this isn't good for me. He now has this like pawn mass in the center that's going to start moving down the board. He's opened the f-file. So I'm going to be stuck defending while he just creates all the threats, e5, d5, d6, for example, bring his rook over, maybe even down to c7. He can sacrifice an exchange if necessary to push one of his pawns through and get a new queen. So I couldn't let that happen, so I have to take the pawn. And he ends up capturing with the pawn. But what happens now is his king gets a little exposed to some potential checks soon. So I play bishop c7. My bishop's not really doing anything on a5, so rerouting it to this diagonal, maybe put some pressure on the h2 pawn is good. And this comes with a little tactical advantage, which is that it might look like I've forgotten to defend my b7 pawn, but queen takes b7 would lose the game on the spot. To bishop takes h2 check, we pick up the queen. So my opponent can't do that. It's kind of a nice little way to reroute my bishop to maybe a more active square like d6, and it gets out of the way of me pushing my pawns. So now I'm all set to start playing b5, a5, for example, get these pawns moving down the board, hopefully create some threats against my opponent that he will have to deal with. So my opponent played rook f2. I didn't really understand this move either. It once again looked like, this rook was going to be more profitably placed on like c1 or b1, either pressuring the c-file or pressuring the ability for me to play b5. Like rook b1, I can no longer play b5. I'm going to have to do something like play b6 or, something to that effect. Apparently maybe queen h3 is a possible move in this spot, threatening to take on h2. But anyway, so he played rook f2. I did play b5, and I started getting my pawns moving down the board. He played king to f1, kind of sidestepping any sort of bishop takes h2 thing that I could have happening. At some point, I played a5, and he played rook b2, which it seemed like he might have been doing a little bit of overreacting to some of my threats. it is going to take a few moves for me to get these pawns rolling down the board, and I think he should prefer to make moves like rook c2, queen c3, you know, threaten to back rank checkmate me or even trade queens or something like that. That felt like a better use of his time than putting his rook, putting his rook on a square like b2, where he knows I'm just going to push b4. So I push b4. He now did play rook c2, and I was curious about this position because I had some options. What I went with was probably not best, but it looks like I'm already back to, according to the computer, mostly an equal position if I just defend against the back rank mate threats with g6. So something like g6, he can play queen c4, and there's only one move I can make. If I were to play something like bishop d6 here, trading the queens is really good for him. I absolutely just lose this endgame. His rook is way too powerful on the open lines. It can stop all of my pawns. Meanwhile, his king now has freedom to come up the board, support his passed pawns, and then he can just push and make a new queen. So I can't let the queens get traded, but what I could do instead of bishop d6 is bishop d8. And now if queen c8, with the queens still on the board and his king being a little bit exposed, I can start creating threats against his king. You know, queen takes f3 is a threat, maybe even king g7 and queen b3 would be a threat to, if he plays queen takes d8, I get his rook. So it looks like I probably could have and should have done this. I don't know what my winning chances are in this kind of position, but at the point in time where I was, where I was in this endgame, I was mostly hoping that, okay, if he makes a few mistakes, maybe I do get to push my pawns and make a new queen, but I understand that I'm down a rook for a bishop, and that's kind of a big deal. So anyway, I ended up not doing that. I just played bishop d6, and I think this is probably a bad move because he instantly kind of capitalized on it, putting a pin against my bishop, and that, also threatening to take one of my passed pawns. And there's not a whole lot I can do about it. Like, if I were to play a5, trying to save my passed pawn, I mean, now both of these pawns are at least protected. He has queen a8 check, and it's not mate yet. I have bishop f8 to defend myself, but rook c8 comes, and the fact that this queen is on this diagonal defending f3 means that eventually, even if I try something like queen h3 check, I'm not going to be able to perpetually check his king over here. So I would basically have to give up this bishop or play something like queen e7 and sit and play a very passive game for a while. Neither of which look great. So I can't really push a4 to defend my pawn because of this threat, which unfortunately meant now I have to play g6. And this is, I think, part of the strength of the g6 move earlier, where had I been in this position, I would then actually have been able to play a4, defend my pawn, start pushing my passed pawns, and create some real issues for him on the queen side. Okay, so I played g6. Rook c6 doesn't immediately win a piece. I do have queen h3 check. So he ended up playing king e2, trying to get out of the checks. I played queen e7, unpinning myself. He did capture my pawn, and I gobbled up his pawn on h2. So king d3 happened. My bishop's under attack. Obviously, I need to move it. So I played bishop back to d6, kind of reinforcing my pawn that I still have, the one asset I have. Now, maybe I can start pushing my h-pawn, but that's going to take a lot of moves, and my opponent is going to create some real threats against my king, or at least threats to trade queens, and as we kind of looked at earlier, that's going to result in a pretty easy win for him. So after bishop d6, he played e4. You know, if my opponent doesn't create any threats, yes, I would maybe have time to start pushing my h-pawn, and then when his rook gets distracted, you know, maybe if his rook comes back this way, then I can bring my queen around like, whoops, like this and this maybe, and then start pushing the b-pawn. So he does need to do something, and his decision was, well, I do have this advantage in the center. Let's start pushing these pawns, create some issues against the dark squared bishop, maybe even get his pawn up to d6 and threaten to make a queen that way. So e4, I played queen f6, mostly just threatening to take this and asking what he's going to do to protect it. Because a move like rook f2, now his rook would be passive. If he brings his king back to e2, this pawn is loose. So, you know, and if he goes to e3, now this f4 square becomes available to both of my queen and bishop for some potential harassment. So he ended up playing queen a8 check, bishop f8, almost the only move. It's possible to play king g7, but e5 would fork the queen and bishop. So we want to avoid that, so bishop f8. He now plays e5, so this is his way of defending the f3 pawn. I played queen f5 check. He brought his queen to the center, and I played queen d7. Finally, he's continuing his plan. He plays d5. I brought my queen over to a4 to start kind of like harassing his king from this side and support my pawn. He played d6, cutting off my bishop from this diagonal. Fortunately, my bishop does have a square out here, which is why a move like g6 earlier was a little better than, for example, h6 or f6 to give my king an escape square. I played queen a3. He went back to d2, and I started pushing my pawn. b3. The rook came back to c1. Apparently, oh yeah, apparently this is already bad for him. Maybe, now, I will say, so this is move 39. I guess you can see that on the score sheet somewhere. Well, it's very tiny. Dude, what is all of this other nonsense that we have? Are these just like other lines from earlier in the game? They are. Okay, well, here we are on move 39. And my opponent was down to, I think, 2 seconds on the clock for the last 4 or 5 moves. Now, we have 5-second delay, so it's not as if he had to move instantly. But I still had about 20 to 25 minutes on my clock, and I was spending some time thinking, trying to give him as many problems as possible. And it looks like rook c1 might have been a big slip on his part. But so this was his 40th move. After this, he got a bit more time to think. But according to the computer, something like rook c8, which looks very scary, by the way, because you've taken your eyes off of the b1 square. And now if black's able to do something like this, it is 3 moves, but black is going to get a new queen pretty quickly. So a little scary to make a move like rook c8 if you haven't fully calculated everything through. So I don't blame my opponent for this rook c1 move. It does allow my bishop to get a little active. So I did play bishop h6 check. Fortunately for my opponent, he has this f4 move, which at the board, I noticed that he was a little shaken when bishop h6 happened. And I think it was because he didn't realize that f4 was actually playable yet. But he saw f4, of course. And I ended up playing b2. Ooh, looks like top line of the computer. So b2 happened. My opponent played rook b1. At this point, it's hard to say that there's something better. to do, but at least rook b1 means this queen will be free to move eventually, so that's kind of what he went with. Rook b1, I played queen all the way over to g3. Right? Let me look at that and confirm for a second. Yeah, I did play queen to g3. Which apparently gave up my advantage? No. Oh, the computer's just all over the place. Maybe these evaluations aren't really to be trusted. It's only Stockfish 11, but depth 20 feels like it should be more than enough to outcalculate my understanding of the position. Anyway, I played queen g3. This looked like the only way to continue the attack. I'm threatening f4. If his rook abandons the b1 square, then, you know, maybe I can just go back to a3, for example. He hasn't really accomplished much yet. And of course, if he takes this, then I have takes. A little unclear what's going on in that kind of position. Maybe the pawn queens, but I'm able to bring my bishop back and trade for it. I will have a queen and 3 pawns versus a queen and a rook. I have no idea if white can win that or not. But it looked like that was a sensible option. So I don't know if rook takes pawn would be reasonable. Also, you know, after bishop takes f4, maybe there's some way that my queen and bishop coordinate and I can actually win his rook. So there's a lot of uncertainty going around about that position. But my opponent after queen g3 ended up playing d7. And that was, I think, the last opportunity he had. Now, I needed to be a little careful at this point. So I did play bishop takes f4. It's kind of the only move. I mean, if queen takes f4, we trade queens. My bishop can get back to stop the pawn, but his rook comes in, and I end up losing. So bishop takes f4 was played. And now you can kind of see all of these 0, 0, 0 evaluations. But there are tricks actually for both sides in this endgame. So the idea from here on out is basically I want to check him in such a way that either I can win both of these pawns or my bishop escapes. And so I'm going to be checking him with my queen almost exclusively, which means that this is still being threatened the entire time, so I need to either be able to move my bishop with check later or force his queen away from the attack of my bishop. So what did he do first? He tried king c2. And, you know, it's actually really nice to look at some of these evaluations later because the computer can see all of these perpetual checks, but I actually, sitting at the board, had to sit around and calculate it. I was honestly thinking when I first played this move that queen h2 was going to be my follow-up. Why did I think queen h2? Well, I forget. Either way, I'm happy that I eventually decided to play queen f2. It looked like getting my queen on this diagonal had better opportunities for the perpetual check at this point. So I did play queen f2. He went to b3. I played queen to b6. Once again, some of my moves are kind of forced. There's only one check in this position that doesn't, you know, that's reasonable. Like I could play queen g3, but as you can see, after a move such as king a2 or king a4, I've run out of checks, and then black is in a bit of trouble. So queen b6. He played queen b4. Again, queen trade, not good for me. So he did play queen b4. I went back to, I went to e6. But again, I could play queen e3. It would basically all result in the same thing. One of the major points here is he can't really play king takes b2 because that leads to this bishop takes e5 with check variation, and then his queen is not staring at my bishop on e5. So that's kind of the idea in this one. So I ended up playing queen e6 check. I was kind of hoping for like a king takes b2 because I think I'm winning here. Yeah, look at this. Because I take this with check and my queen's actually hitting the d7 pawn. So he goes like king c2, for example. I was just going to take the pawn. So now I would have bishop 3 pawns versus rook, and this might actually be a win. So I still had some ideas in this position, but he ended up playing queen c4. I went back to b6. He played king a3. And I kind of realized that this diagonal was fine to stay on, so I could have gone like queen a5, which would have been maybe a bit of a more forcing line. But I ended up just playing queen a7. So he went queen a4, I played queen c5 check, queen b4, queen a7 check, and at this point we agreed to a draw. So kind of a cool game. We didn't end up winning the match. we got slaughtered. So I in fact knew the results of all the other games by the time my game had finished, and all of the other 3 boards had lost their games. This was a fairly strong team. I think most, if not all, of their players were 1900 rated or higher. And of course I was playing someone on board 1 who was a little stronger than that. But yeah, so that was the last game of the tournament. I finished with 2.5 points out of 6, which was not too bad considering all things considered. I did play a variety of opponents of different skill levels, which was great, but they were all the top board for their team, and they all played really strong chess, so pretty happy with my results. I think our team overall was pretty happy. The boards 3 and 4 players for our team, I think, were rated 13 or 1400, and they played very well. They got I think they each got 3 points out of 6 games. And same thing with my board 2. Our second board also got 3 points out of 6 games. So kind of makes sense that our team score ultimately was 3 points out of 6, considering almost everyone got about 3 out of 6 for the tournament. But yeah, it was loads of fun. And I guess that's going to wrap up chess for this decade. Maybe. We'll see. I might be convinced to do some more chess streams or something.